Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We've got a lot to talk about today. We are recording on Wednesday, March 4th, a touch after our regular reporting time. We have this unfolding war that the U.S. is in with Iran alongside Israel. And Iran is obviously trying to bring in as many other players as possible. They're in a difficult bind since they're it's easiest for them to bring in other countries against them. But we'll get to that in a minute. We also have the results of a number of elections from last night. Probably the most high profile of which is the Senate primaries down in Texas. But before we get to that, I want to tell you that yesterday we kicked off our annual membership drive here at TPM. I know that probably most of the people who listen to, or a majority of the people we think who listen to the podcast are members of the website talkingpointsmemo.com. But if you are not, please consider becoming a member. This is super, super important. This is how we fund what we do. Are the funding of TPM is something like 90% from membership and reader fees. So this is really critical, and it goes beyond just us as a news organization individually. We are in a time where independent news organizations are especially critical. And what I mean by that, or one of the things I mean by that, is if you look at the the political context that we have today with a president like President Trump, especially how he has acted in his second term as president, basically no news organization that is owned by a big diversified corporation can be truly independent because they're too vulnerable to a rogue president. Regulatory reasons, mergers, they can't afford to offend this president. And that means that the news organizations that they own can't really either. And we've seen example after example of that over the last year. So, independent news organizations like TPM, who don't answer to any outside force, player, ownership, in parent ownership or something like that, that we're a subsidiary of some big corporation, doesn't work that way. All the decisions at TPM are made within the organization by the people who edit and write the news. So we are very different, and news organizations like us are very important, especially at a time like now. So if you're not a member, consider joining. There's going to be a link in the show notes, a place you can sign up. If you sign up during the drive, you get a 25% discount in addition to all the other good, warm, and fuzzy feelings you get for joining, and also access to more content that we produce on the website. So, with that aside, my co host, Kate, let's start with the news. I mean, Iran is ongoing, but we had big news last night. Some, I don't know, semi surprises. Let's start with Texas. What happened in Texas last night? What do you make of it?
So on the Democratic side, James Talarico, the member of the Texas State House, won outright. No runoff there. He beat Jasmine Crockett. Not not a landslide, but I would say handily. AP called the race early this morning at like 3 a.m. And then on the Republican side, as expected, ever since it became a race between three men. We had John Cornyn, the incumbent, who has been in the Senate for 4 terms already, Ken Paxton, the kind of main character attorney general from Texas, who's used that outpost as a cradle of the culture war, and then inexplicably, really, I don't know why, Wesley Hunt, who is just kind of like another MAGA guy who was in the House, and his only kind of distinguishing characteristic is that he's younger than the other two men, and I think he thought that would be kind of enough of a selling point. But all his entry into the race really did is guarantee that no one would get over 50%, and they have to go to a 3-month runoff, which is the situation right now. asterisks, and we'll come back to why it's an asterisk because some news just happened right before we started recording. But kind of preliminary data. We don't have exits here, so proceed with caution when you're reading the kind of pundit takes today. But some things we do know is that turnout, particularly on the Democratic side, unbelievably high, outpacing the presidential primary votes in 2020, which, the last time there was kind of an active competitive primary for the Democratic side. Um, we can kind of extrapolate from the way how places voted that it seems, and this was suggested in some polling beforehand, even though the polling on the Democratic side was really kind of all over the map and didn't end up being quite right. But it seems that Talarico had an edge with white voters and Hispanics, and that Crockett really had the market cornered on black voters. um, but she didn't end up kind of getting the Assad numbers she needed from the big cities, and that included there was some chaos in Dallas, thanks to a kind of Republican voter suppression of changing up the precincts where people would vote, and perhaps more to come on that front. But Talarico won handily enough that they didn't have to kind of wait and litigate Dallas. So he'll be the standard bearer there. And then, like we say, the runoff on the other side. Except right before we started recording, Trump posted on Truth Social that he is going to be making an endorsement on the Republican side imminently, and that he wants the person he doesn't endorse to drop out. So we can kind of take from that. Conventional wisdom has it that Republicans think Talarico is the stronger candidate, and that
Mm-hmm.
they see the worst case scenario as Talarico versus Paxton, which is kind of likely because a runoff voting pool is even more of your hardos than the people who run in the primary. So it's going to be the real right wing freaks who show out, after Labor Day to vote. Um, and so so what we extrapolate there is that Trump will probably endorse Cornyn and probably tell Paxton to drop out, which I think is just so unbelievably delicious because there is such a chance that Paxton won't listen, and we can get into kind of all the reasons I think that. But can you imagine that situation where Trump is doing the most un-Trumpy thing ever? He's like endorsing the guy that he doesn't like as much because he sees Cornyn as kind of a rhino and Paxton is much more kind of in his mold. But
Right.
every single force in establishment Washington is like, you have to endorse Cornyn. If he loses, then Talarico might win and we could lose the seat. This kind of calculus that Trump doesn't really like to do. And then he
Right.
does all that, and Paxton says, "Yeah, go fuck yourself."
I'm curious. It's, I mean, it could be wishful thinking on my part. It could definitely be wishful thinking on my part. And I say this very much going in, but it, it just seems energetically not in the vibe that Paxton has been following this whole cycle. I mean,
Totally.
he was making trouble to start with, and he basically, at least when the last the a couple of things. So the last results I saw, he was like 1 percentage point behind Cornyn, but both of them are around 40%. So it's like, that's a tie, and you can certainly say that, like, for an incumbent to for Cornyn as the incumbent to have, that is a big sign of problems for Cornyn. I mean, one way to look at this, and I want to ask about this again. I mean, the third party got, or third party, the also ran guy who got like 10%, I think, something like that, or maybe actually more than 10, maybe a little more than 10%. That basically it's Cornyn against two MAGA guys, and the MAGA guys got like 60%. So that is that's a big problem for Cornyn. So it's not like this isn't a case where you could imagine a scenario where maybe Cornyn gets 45% and Paxton, what is the other guy's name again? I forget.
Wesley Hunt.
All right, Wesley Hunt maybe, both get a little over 25%, and the sort of Trump comes in and says, look, Cornyn won here. We have to kind of, technically it's a runoff, but he's got it. Everybody stand down. That's not what happened here. This result is pretty devastating for Cornyn in anything but a context in which you thought he might lose outright, which wasn't impossible here. Um,
Well, there was
so
also a
yeah,
feeling though that Corn I would say conventional wisdom had that you probably would have expected Paxton to be up by 5 to maybe even 10 points on Cornyn. Every single poll showed Paxton up by
okay,
like 4 or 5 points. So
okay,
there is some thinking that Trump, being all of 5 years old, that seeing Cornyn as like the top finisher is actually important in compelling him
right,
to
right,
throw
right,
his weight behind someone who's not like an obvious loser. So
right,
that one
right, right.
percentage point, I totally agree, for an incumbent that in normal times that'd be like, oh God, a huge problem, but it might actually have won Cornyn the endorsement in this situation.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's definitely possible. And again, I mean, it is there has been, I guess the other side of this is that there's been a fierce competition among Paxton and Cornyn for his endorsement. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say from Paxton, as much as wanting his endorsement is not wanting him to endorse Cornyn. Just don't endorse Cornyn. Stay out, stay out, stay out. Um, and I guess it is plausible that if Trump is actually, and for our listeners, Trump at various points um, over the last I don't know 6 months or something like that has Cornyn has been begging for this endorsement, and he has not gotten it. And it's not that Trump didn't know that Cornyn wanted it. And there's been a few cases, I think, where Cornyn, Trump's visiting Texas, and Cornyn, kind of has to beg to get on the plane with him, and then Trump kind of gives him the cold shoulder and all this kind of stuff. So, in a in a sense, his coming out and saying it's Cornyn, I love Cornyn, it has to be Cornyn, all that nonsense he does about his full and complete whatever that that nonsensical phrasing he has about his endorsements. But you could it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility for Paxton to just say no. Um, and I guess the other thing is that if Cornyn was only able to get 40% of the vote in his primary, where he's the incumbent, and then Trump comes in and basically shuts it down, again, some wishful thinking on my part here, but that is a scenario where you might have some real problems, like uniting Republicans in favor of Cornyn in the general election. I don't know
Yeah.
what's your sense of all that.
Okay, I think the fascinating point of this is if this teased endorsement goes the way we think that it will, it's for Cornyn, it's for Paxton to drop out. If you're Paxton, there's like a really good argument to ignore that. That's not just kind of like fuck you, I do what I want. I mean, even if you think that Paxton is the weaker candidate, and I think this primary result probably does give us more data points to that effect. And going into it, I was a little more skeptical of that take because yeah, like Paxton has so much baggage, right? He was impeached by a Republican House. He has been investigated for fraud and bribery. He had like a really scandalous infidelity scandal with his wife that he used his office to cover up. But we're in the Trump era. So I wasn't as convinced that in a state like Texas, a scandal ridden MAGA warrior type would really be such a liability. But I think Cornyn's strength in the primary, maybe that does kind of, give a data point to that argument. But even still, Paxton versus Talarico, no one in the world would say Talarico's got it in the bag. I think you would
Exactly,
say
exactly.
it's a long shot, and this is about as good as conditions can get for Talarico. So if you're Paxton, you still are the favorite, if you win this to win this seat. So, the only forces that I think would keep you from pursuing that or A, do we really believe he's enough of a party man to be worried about Republicans losing the seat? No, I think we can pretty much put that aside. The only compelling thing is he willing for Trump to be really mad at him? Like, does he see Trump's hatred as kind of blunting his political future? I'm not so clear on that, but and again, could be wishful thinking. I can see a world where Paxton makes the calculation that if I win this seat, by the time I'm up again, Trump is off the stage anyway. So who gives a shit, right? You just kind of have to like endure his anger for a few months and figure
Mhm.
out a way for it not to kind of kill your momentum and candidacy, and then you're kind of off to the races. And it's not that hard for me to see Paxton as one of these guys that do exist in the MAGA universe who are like kind of convinced rightly or wrongly of their own bright future, so they're willing to be a little more of a rogue agent and not to be such a Trump toady because they've got their own MAGA bona fides to kind of fall back on.
Yeah, I think another part of that is that we've seen that Trump can, nothing Trump ever says is permanent. It's all contingent on how things play out. And I feel like I've seen a few of these guys actually do what I'm about to describe. Is I would like, you're right that he's never going to say fuck Trump. What it would be more something like, Trump may not be supporting me, but I support Trump. And he's, I think some of the insiders have kind of given him an
Mhm.
unrealistic view of this
Bad
situation.
advice, right?
Bad advice to the king is getting bad advice, but I support the king. And I think we all know that. I mean, that is that's quite plausible. I mean plausible in the sense of course it's plausible. I'm sure Trump would much rather would Trump doesn't support Cornyn. He's just someone is people are telling him like, who cares whether you like Cornyn? We need this. We absolutely positively need this seat. He's the guy who can win it. And if you do this, you're gonna, you lose control of the Senate, all that kind of stuff. So Trump is convinced or whatever. So that's how he would do it. Um, who knows? It would be pretty wild to, after all. I mean, every regular Republican, they've all been against this from the very beginning. And I take your point that he may have underperformed the polls a little, um, maybe a few points. And it is certainly some level of symbolic victory if Cornyn is a point ahead of him or something like that. And it may be very important for Trump. Um, but it would certainly be weird to see him just go, okay, yep, you're right. I'm bowing out. Notwithstanding that I just tied the incumbent and now we're in a runoff, I'm just gonna like end my campaign. I mean, having said that, we've seen we've seen, what was it? Well, I'm trying to think of the last time we saw that there was Marjorie Green, right? That we're kind of like, Marjorie has her own brand, you know, sure she's at war with Trump, but that's about Trump's declining power and all that kind of stuff. And she unloads on Trump and everybody's like, wow, it's a it's a new era. And like a day later, she's like, okay, you know what else? I'm retiring. And we're like, oh, okay. I guess you can't go up against Trump. So who
Right.
knows? I don't know. I have no idea.
And the other piece of this equation is that Cornyn spent like $70 million on the primary alone. And a lot of that money came from the Senate Leadership Fund, which is, controlled by the Senate Majority Leader. And Paxton spent almost nothing. Like it was a little hubristic. He was kind of coming at it from like, I have such high name ID in Texas that I don't really have to do this work. But Cornyn's like massive ad buy did end up moving the numbers. Like he was in really dire straits when things began. And after he spent so much money, he kind of caught up to Paxton. And then he and Paxton both kind of trained their fire on Hunt at the end of the race to, you know, they were trying to not be forced into a runoff, but they didn't end up, driving his numbers down enough. So you also have to contemplate what Trump wants to happen here is he endorses Cornyn, Paxton drops out. You don't have to spend any more money on this race until you get into the general. Because, I mean, that's the great asymmetry right now, right? Democrats have 3 months to kind of like have the Crockett people lick the wounds, bring everyone back together, get a head start on the general while Republicans are duking it out. But if you have a situation where Paxton is at all kind of reluctant, they are going to have to spend heavily to boost Cornyn in an even more kind of right wing environment on top of this existing dynamic that you have where Democratic voters are just much better at being strategic than Republican voters. And that has not always benefited them, right? Like, I think that has led to some overly cautious choices that have kind of left the party with these establishment candidates that nobody's very excited about. But Republican voters just have not shown that same aptitude at all. We've had so many cycles now of, Mitch McConnell trying to get like the kind of sane Republican governor of a state to run. He's like, yeah, I'd rather die. Thanks, no. And then, they vote for Doug Mastriano or something, someone completely unwinnable in the general. We've seen this over and over and over. So, that is also kind of layered on top here. They would have to do a huge pressure campaign to try to get Texas voters to vote for like the non-exciting institutionalist, mild-mannered guy over the kind of big MAGA warrior. And while they are going to be having to fiercely contest in a bunch of other states that should be easier than Texas. So, I mean, if Paxton doesn't just kind of like yes sir and obey Trump immediately, they're going to have to make some decisions about whether or not to kind of cut Cornyn loose here and just roll the dice with Paxton, or just keep like $70 million, and we're like a third of the way through the race. That's crazy.
Yeah, no, it is wild, and maybe Paxton will just drop out. The problem with that is just that is his only ace in the hole. I say that somewhat ironically, has been the Texas voters keep making him attorney general. Right? He's got a lock hold on the democracy thing, sad as it may be. But like everyone else in the Republican Party basically like hates the dude. And it's like universally understood that he's like really sleazy, even by like MAGA standards. I mean, he doesn't just work in one area of like crimes and stuff. There's the fraud and abusing employees of the attorney general's office, and a kind of certainly a messy divorce. I mean, in a certain sense, it's not like MAGA seems to have really like high like marital fidelity standards. Even having said that, it's that's a problem for him. And I mean, my God, I mean, he was impeached by the completely uh the state legislature, or the state house, I guess, that is like a fully owned subsidiary of the state Republican Party. So I don't know. And as the other point is I don't know, these you take like, we've had Beto, Colin Allred, we've had these races where obviously where the Democrats came up short. They didn't come up that much short in either of those cases, especially with Beto, which I think was in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So that was another sort of Trump blowback election. So I guess then you had the people thinking Ted Cruz sucks. That was, John Cornyn is sort of a soft soap kind of character. Having said that, I mean, again, looking on the optimistic side of things for Democrats, um, by current MAGA standards, John Cornyn is pretty rhino-ish. And if you have a primary in which he only, battled the MAGA guy to a draw, and especially if Trump comes in and puts his thumb on the scale, you can see that, you can see the ways in which Cornyn is not necessarily a terribly strong candidate, not because he's insane like Paxton, but just because he seems weak and being sort of carried over the finish line, um, and not you know uh, out of tune with where MAGA is. So I guess we'll find out like
Yeah,
momentarily who the who's getting endorsed, even though we
right.
probably know.
That's a good way to segue to the Democratic side of things. I I like have no optimism whatsoever. I think there's like no shot that Talarico wins, to be honest with you, because I just like
I
all red
with either Cornyn and
with either. Yeah,
okay,
I think all red wasn't very close at all. Beto was close,
right,
but Beto was running against like a famously repugnant figure, and
yeah,
it was the it boy campaign of the cycle, right? It got like a ton of coverage. It was like
hmm
the one that was, if you lived there was I assume like exciting to vote for. It's kind of
hmm
like
hmm
Mom Donnie and whatever. Like every cycle we kind of have this like usually a man who is young and exciting to people and gets like Fetterman before who gets like a ton of coverage and we're all rising star and blah blah blah. And
hmm
2018 was a good year for Democrats and
yep,
like still and also Beto at that time had carved out something of a more idiosyncratic platform to run on. And I don't want to get
hmm
too bogged down by this idea that like voters are political science majors who are really paying attention to platform. Like I do think vibes matter more than anything else. But Talarico has been more openly progressive and openly progressive on TV in a way that I think he is going to like struggle with. The kind of big example that's already coming up is when he was like fighting a ban of trans women in sports. He said that God is non-binary. I mean, you can just see that clip like really doing numbers in Texas.
hmm
Um, so I don't know, and maybe I'm just pessimistic. I think that Democrats making Republicans like fight to this extent in Texas already is kind of a win. And I
yep,
am just of the opinion that like you're not gonna I mean, my take on this. The Democrat that's gonna win Texas, I think, is gonna be kind of like a prodigious political talent. But that being said, competing seriously there cycle after cycle and building up the infrastructure and netting new voters like that is the unglamorous work that leads towards a Georgia situation. Right now Georgia's like on the table for Democrats every election, and that's important to do regardless. But I will say so much of the stuff on the Democratic side was roiled by this electability talk, right? This the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that a black woman can't win the candidacy. And then you also had the more substantive piece, right, which is that Jasmine Crockett has kind of run as like a resistance lib, like a very anti-Trump um
hmm
persona. Like that is kind of that's her whole thing. And so I think you had the kind of unseemly black women can't win, the maybe more understandable can a black woman win in a deep red state, and then also the more just kind of purely intellectual side of she does not play as a moderate for the reasons that are fair and unfair, right? And that Talrico, I think, got to claim a little bit more of a moderate mantle just because of self presentation. And that
right,
includes him being
right.
a white man, but that also includes him talking about like Jesus a lot. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in the general. And that it's going to be a really good data point for us to know, is it all vibes based? Do people does he appear moderate enough that he is able to like kind of make good on his game plan, which is peeling off soft Republicans and independents and, running up the numbers with Hispanics, and he's gonna have to win black people back. And, it remains to be seen if Jasmine Crockett will help with that. She's made some comments this morning that does not sound like she's very eager to help with that. So we'll see. That would be the winning coalition for him, but it just you feel like everything has to go really right.
So here's the question I have for you. Purely factual one. I had, I hadn't, I'm sure seen every poll, but the sort of the vibe I was getting was that she was ahead of him, and that's why a lot of Democrats, or at least kind of professional Democrats and people in the party committees and stuff like that were kind of freaking out that she was ahead, and he had structured this whole campaign with a certain message before she got in, and now she got in, and she's going to win. So am I basically right about the polls? Because I mean, he didn't just win a little. I mean, he it was a pretty decisive win, like at least half a dozen points, I think, maybe more. Am,
Well, there weren't a lot of public polls done of this race in general, but the ones that we had were pretty bullish on Crockett. A lot of them were old. Got some suggestion from the polls that Talarico was surging late, and the biggest one, there was an Emerson poll put into the field, which is like one of these really good, expensive pollsters, and they had one, I think, just in this last week that had him up 5 or
mm,
something, which is,
okay, which is about where it came
ish
out,
where
more or
we
less.
where we
Yeah,
ended. But yeah, the
yeah.
polling on the Democratic side was really not great, even though, I mean, like we said, polling on the Republican side was very bullish on Paxton, and primary polling is just hard. There's not a lot of it. The swings tend to be a lot bigger.
Mm-hmm. 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 Is there? I mean, it's funny. I think I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are, but um, and here's I well, if it's Paxton, you have a lot of stuff that Paxton is so sleazy and so out there. Okay, so there's that. If it's Paxton, um, it's funny with the Talarico thing. I feel like this is in some ways starting to become more like conventional wisdom. But when people's like when they want to signal they're moderates, there's two axes of that are often conflated in the discussions of politics that you see out of Washington D.C., which is you've got to I don't know, you go out and say, "Yeah, I'm a shooter. I go out and hunt," and maybe you say some stuff about trans politics or stuff like that. That my sense is that there's that there's signaling about certain high profile issues that you're saying I'm not like every other Democrat, or there's this other one which is how much you are a fighter. You are you see things in very partisan terms. Democrats have to fight to win against Republicans. Those two things get conflated, but they're not the same thing. But I do think that I guess Talarico has been, to a certain extent, trying to position himself as a moderate on both of those. He's certainly not. He's certainly not pitching himself as like a partisan warrior, right? Which is, I guess, it depends on which thing you're thinking of. I mean, that's why these a lot of these metaphors or a lot of these kind of positioning things sort of they're a lot squishier than they are made out to be. I guess I would say this on the global issue, if you especially if you have Paxton, but in some ways I'm not sure Paxton and Cornyn are that different in terms of the strength of their candidacies, because I think they're both relatively weak or maybe very weak candidacies for very different reasons. That said, it's Texas, so I think you can still win at being very weak. Um, Having said this, though, I do think there is a decent amount of evidence at this point that that the partisan animus against the president and against the Republican Party going into 2026 may be significantly greater than it was in 2018. And I think until relatively recently, the idea was, well, the Democrats will have the wind at their backs, but it's not going to be like they had in 2018 when like no one liked Trump and stuff like that. In any case, the sort of optimistic view is in a really blowout election, you have a kind of a safe Democrat with with sort of a slightly different brand identity than the last two guys they put up against a Republican. That a big tide may bring everybody across. Having said that, I certainly know, we certainly know, listeners certainly know that there are fairly blue states that Republicans are always like, "Oh, we're so so close. It's we came within 5 points in like a New Jersey or something, one of these states like this." And you have this fallacy of numerical proximity, which is it's only 5 points, just a little more oomph, and you can do it. But that's very deceptive because, in fact, those 5 points are people who will never, in like a New Jersey, who will never vote for a Republican. So you may seem close, but that's like, I don't know, some analogy more close is meaningless. But I do think it's possible, but it is absolutely, it is very much a long shot. And it's I guess there are few s- I th- there are few states, I think, in which the vote totals seem relatively close. You know, presidentials, contested Senate races, stuff like that, relatively close. They're not 20 points. And yet, Texas has not elected any Democrat to any statewide race in what, 25 years? Maybe longer, maybe since Ann Richards. I can't even like they just don't elect Democrats. And that's profound and structural.
So the thing that's interesting about Talarico and why I think some of the treatment of like Crockett as the fighter and Talarico as the kind of squishy moderate, it just really didn't capture it because he came up, like he gained attention and a following online because he would joust with Republicans in the state house all the time. That
Hmm.
was the
Hmm.
springboard to get him to go. He had his big appearance on Joe Rogan, where by the end of the conversation, Rogan was like, "You got to run for president, man." Like that was his bread and butter. Was
Hmm.
kind of the Buttigieg thing, like going
Yep.
into right wing spaces and being conversant and agile and telegenic. So he was kind of being like he was a lib fighter, right?
Hmm.
He
Hmm.
just has since kind of calibrated his message to be whereas Crockett kind of took the lane of, I will punch back at Republicans. Talrico made his thing more this, progressive Christianity. We have a big tent. We can accept anyone who's been kind of, led astray by Trump, like come back, my kind of sons and daughters. Um, but that has not conveyed into kind of moderation on other grounds. Like he has been, talking about how you need retribution for the Trump administration in the future, kind of like the keep records, like we'll be back,
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Hmm.
And it makes him a compelling candidate because it doesn't so kind of neatly fall into these boxes. And I think the fact that he was able to go from like a complete unknown with Hispanics in the state to dominating with them, like that is interesting to me. My concern is just he's doing the love versus hate thing. And
Hmm.
that one in the primary, right? The hate versus hate take like didn't work. But we've we've seen this movie before, right? And he's a more talented politician than Joe Biden, but that was Biden's theory of the case. Like this is a fight for the soul of America, and if we show people a model that isn't acrimonious and small and bullying and cruel, they will prefer that. And that just has not been the case. And I'm just really not convinced that Texans are suddenly going to be like, I am sick of this, this model of a politician and I want to go back to the nice guy. We don't have any evidence that, people in red or purple states like really want that. Well, red states, I should say. We don't have examples that red states or maybe countrywide has been jonesing for that since Trump came on the stage.
Yeah, I think this is a good point because I have seen him presented as he's the centrist. He's, positioning himself. He's a squishy moderate. And I actually started following him, I don't know, 6, 7, maybe 8 months ago. And I found him, I'm not sure compelling. Like I thought he was going to win the Senate races before he was even in the Senate race. And at least I'm sure people in Texas knew that's what he was building towards, but I wasn't clear on that. He's as you said, he's sort of like, kind of going, uh, uh, duking it out directly with um, Republicans, kind of on their own turf, but doing so on rhetorical ground that people see as exclusively Republican. A centrality of religion, Christianity, all this kind of stuff. So it does go to sort of the flimsiness of these constructs of like, oh, moderate versus resistance lib. I mean, part of it is, Crockett. I mean, at some level, what people don't want to say is that Crockett, the fact that she's African American, an African American woman, she is very coded as resistance lib to start with. She also has an urban district, which is also House district, which is also totally coded, resistance lib. So I don't know. It's, I guess I would say this. It is, if nothing else, it will help the Democrats to, regardless of which Republican is running, if Republicans have to spend real money to defend Cornyn, that's a win already, right? And I mean, my God, they've already spent $70 million, so like they've already spent a ton of money. So I guess we will. I guess we will see. And I would just say this: I do think that I think there are a lot of signs that the blowback against Trump is still being significantly underestimated in the U.S. political conversation. But we'll find out soon enough.
Ooh, all right, we have to move on to Iran. I just want to say really briefly some like kind of lesser headlines from the elections last night. Dan Crenshaw is out of a job. Kind of fascinating. There was a time there where he was the new face of the Republican Party. Like he was the young guy. He's a veteran. He was kind of pugnacious, but almost kind of the way Nancy Mace was portraying herself, like
For
the
like
new
6 months.
generation. Yeah, exactly. Um, and Crenshaw never ended up kind of same. I mean, same to Mace before she kind of like went off the deep end. Is like they never really made good on that. Ended up being a kind of a reliable MAGA foot soldier who was just like kind of a prick, like a little condescending to people. Um, Pretty shocking loss though. Didn't even go to a runoff. That's how bad he got walloped. So he's done. Tony Gonzales, who we were covering at TPM, we mentioned him last episode. He is the guy who kind of bullied his staffer into having an affair with him, and she committed suicide when he broke it off. He is in a runoff with a Republican who calls himself the AK guy because he loves guns so much. Our colleague Josh Kavinsky has a great got him on the phone and had a great interview with him. So definitely check that piece out because their fight will drag on there.
So
And the
that one
other,
does go to a runoff.
that's a runoff. Another one that goes to a runoff, which is kind of interesting, is Al Green, who our readers will probably remember as he kind of makes a stir always at the State of the Union and usually gets escorted out and censured afterwards. He's like a trillion years old, but doesn't really. He fights, right? Like I
Yeah.
don't know that it's fair to tag him with the same kind of geriatric complaints that people have about most of the party.
Well, he also doesn't, like, when you see him, he's clearly not a young man, but he's not like he, when you see him, you're like, "Oh my god, this guy in an assisted living facility." You don't some of these members, you're like, "Wow, this person is not in
I
good
don't
shape," and he
know,
doesn't.
Josh. He looks
No,
pretty
maybe
old.
okay.
He kind of shuffles around.
All right, okay, maybe. Well, you see him in person. I don't see him in person.
Yeah.
I just see him when he's getting sorted out. I guess he didn't. Okay, well,
Yeah. But he's in a very contentious runoff
okay.
with someone who's new to the house, who's a really young guy. So that'll be kind of an interesting episode of, is age all it takes? Like, are the torches kind of going to be knocked out of these people's hands if they're willing to pass them or not?
And is
Um,
this one of these cases where two incumbents are sort of smushed into a district because of the
right.
redistricting? Okay.
Exactly, yeah. Um, oh, and just the only other one I wanted to mention, there's some down ballot stuff that is kind of interesting. There was like an Arkansas state level seat that it was like a 26 swing, went to the Democrat or something. But one that's going to be notable is you had the North Carolina Senate primaries, which were all but uncontested on both sides. But Roy Cooper, like Assad numbers, right? It had like over 90% of Democrats voting for him. And then this guy, Michael Wheatley, on the other side, who is kind of charismatic, just kind of like a Trump, henchman who was like given
Right.
his marching orders. He
Right.
only had something like in the 60s of Republican support. And maybe they'll come home to roost, as it goes on. But that's going to be a really important race. And, credit to Schumer where it's due. Cooper is the best possible recruit you could have gotten in it. So, strong start for him.
So, okay, so the next thing we are going to talk about is the fact that since we last spoke to you, the U.S. is involved in a pretty big shooting war in the Middle East, and one that was entirely of its own making. And the White House is making this argument that it's not of our making. Remember the 1979 hostage crisis, and remember the bombing. Hezbollah's bombing of the U.S. embassy bombing in Beirut, which I can't remember if it was in 1981 or 1983. In any case, the long 40 plus year litany of many very real terrorist attacks and incidents in between by Iran all this time. What is your kind of global take on what we're seeing?
It's crazy. Like, it feels like the most political suicide kind of thing that Trump has done so far. And I think it's pretty obvious what he thought going in, because he's like said it, that he thought they could do it in the way that was similar to the Maduro kidnapping, right? Kind of strike once, big, flashy, and then be done before you get the kind of demoralization and the war drag and the lots of Americans being killed. But this bears no resemblance to that, and it's not completely clear to me how Trump just exits at this point, even if I am so sure that maybe as soon as within like a week, that's what he's going to want to do.
Yeah.
Um, just because Marco Rubio said pretty explicitly that like we are in this at the behest of Israel, and Israel's not going to want the United States to leave, I mean, and you just get the feeling that the dominoes have been knocked over at this point. Like, things have already begun. So, I mean, that's insane. To me, the biggest political threat after Trump started this, and we've already had some American service members die in the region, but the big threat is a retaliatory strike on American soil, right? Like some kind of terrorist attack. There was something in Austin, this like terrible shooting by someone who had some Iranian signifiers, but it's not super clear that the two things are linked, at least yet, and maybe that will come out and be a big deal. But to me, that's the big risk, because nothing will turn Americans against this even more than they already are, than seeing blood spilled kind of up close and personal like that for a war that nobody wants. And you already see Republicans kind of laying the groundwork to avert that if it happens. You have a ton of similarly worded tweets coming out of congressional Republicans about like wow, it was kind of insane that Democrats are doing the DHS shutdown, isn't it? When we are so vulnerable right now. And you know exactly what they're going to do. If that strike happens, they're going to say, well, DHS was shut down, the homeland was not secured, and that's because of Democrats. And it's kind of genius in the way of strategy like that. And also, I just think throws into really sharp relief Democrats' discomfort with hanging the death of Americans so far around Trump's neck, which they absolutely should do. It's his fault. Like, he
Hmm.
started this strike. He didn't seemingly kind of secure where these people were at all. We're now in the world where we have like thousands of American citizens that are just stranded in nearby countries because he did fuck all to try to get them out before the violence started. So that's just something that's really struck me in these past few days. Just and of course, we have like Hillary Clinton is like back on the scene, and it just makes you think about those deaths in Benghazi where Republicans hung those around her neck for years. And as messy as Benghazi was, like the proceedings and the comments, it completely worked. It tarred her so successfully. And you don't hear any congressional Democrats doing the same with Trump and these service members. You have these kind of like, statements coming from Schumer that are like, well, Iran is bad. Don't get me wrong. They are bad, but he did not ask Congress. And it's like, come on. He is starting a Middle Eastern war that nobody wants. Like, every American, except the very youngest ones, has terrible associations with these foreign entanglements. Like, he has gifted this to you. Use it. Hang it around his neck. Every single thing that goes wrong is his fault. Remember what they did to Biden in the Afghanistan pullout? Like, come on. Let's go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my only rejoinder to that, and I agree with everything you're saying. My general sense, whether it is strategic or not for Democrats, is that people will know to blame Trump. People started on day one of this when people are most supportive. It was already like 60-40 against.
Yeah.
Um, and this is sort of expanding very quickly. Not, yeah, I mean, Iran is in a very difficult situation since obviously what they need to do is bring other players into the mix. Right now, it is the US and Israel against Iran when Iran is already on its, on its back, basically. They're already like devastated in terms of deterrent and military power by what the stuff that happened in 2025, the stuff that happened with their proxies in 2024. So that standoff is existential for them. So they need to bring new they need to expand it and get, they need to sort of roll the dice and hope that some other configuration comes in. The problem is that their main way of rolling the dice is attacking other countries in the region. And nominally, they at least in most of these cases they say they're attacking U.S. facilities in Qatar or United Arab Emirates or wherever, but like no one likes their country being attacked. Attacks within their country. So their main their main ability to escalate, to expand, is to bring more countries against them because they're attacked. So that's a tough situation. Um, their more promising uh, angle is to basically shut down shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, to just cut off oil supplies to and these days that's really mainly oil supplies to Asia because that's where a lot of that oil goes. But obviously, it's a global oil market, so Asia feels it first, but that just means that the price of oil skyrockets, and those things get dicey really fast. And obviously, that uh, you know. Um, gas prices are notorious in the U.S. as drivers, as downward drivers of presidential popularity. It is a big driver of inflation, not nearly as much as it used to be, since oil is plays a much smaller role in the global economy than it used to. Not just because renewables, but the there used to be a lot of other things in the economy that were heavily dependent on the price of oil. It was a bigger driver of inflation. But given how big an issue inflation is right now in current US politics, you don't have to have much of a spike for it to be very bad news for the president. And you know, there is if you go into something like this with a pretty decisive majority of the population saying like, what are we, why are we, not like, oh, I'm going to go to the protest, but like, what the fuck? Like, like I'm not even against all wars, but like, why are we doing this one? um when things start to go wrong, when you start saying like, wow, we're kind of in a real war here, this isn't where like we just kill a few people and we're done, and like we let Iran do a few symbolic missile strikes against our facilities that don't really hit anything just so they can kind of save face internally. um that sort of, that can spin out of control really really quickly. And as you say, I was just working on a post when we started this episode of the podcast, that I, I just, if you, okay, let's start with the premise, just as a thought experiment. Start with the premise that the U.S. had to go to war here, that it was in the U.S. interest, it had to be done. Maybe you can say that we were facing some, immediate threat from Iran, whatever it is. If you start with that premise, you say like, look, we are it's an existential war for them. We are saying that we're going to destroy their regime, destroy their um, overthrow their government. So everything is on, everything is at stake for them. Yes, they're going to try to escalate. Yes, they're going to try to cut off oil supplies. And you could sort of say like, it's, yes, we knew it'd be kind of messy, but we have to do this. And it's, you can't say things are going terribly, because these are the predictable things they will do, because we are trying to roll up their whole state, to overthrow their whole revolution. So from that set of assumptions, it's fair to say that it's 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 overstatement to say things are going badly. On the other hand, if you start from the assumption of kind of like we really didn't have to do this at all, like Iran is weaker than they have been in decades, arguably since only a few years after the Iranian Revolution. We've sort of, really shattered a lot of their military strength. Um, we have, mostly Israel has rolled up their proxies throughout the Middle East, all this kind of stuff. So we kind of did this for nothing, or no really clear reason. And I think the American public, for better or worse, has a has a pretty high tolerance for doing things for basically for nothing, as long as nothing goes wrong, or as long as like a lot of Americans don't get killed. Like, okay, there's very very few Americans who have any sympathy for the Iranian regime. That's not the same as saying, oh, they're a big threat, but very very few Americans have any love lost for that government. um, but if you start seeing big spikes in oil prices and big inflationary pressures in the global economy, and you start seeing, I don't know, if you just have a real shooting war in that part of the world. And at least, I see kind of updates each morning like, oh, Americans are stranded in this country and they're trying to buy private jets to escape. Like, you hear that and you're like, that doesn't sound good. That sounds like things are kind of fucked up all of a sudden. If just random people are trying to like book flights out of an entire region because it's so dangerous. I just don't think Donald Trump had any realistic idea of what he was getting into here. And I basically think this happened because he did this, what was tactically an extremely successful raid into Venezuela. You know, uh, whatever you think of it, I mean, that is just unquestionably true, and managed to pull off this thing where he's now kind of running Venezuela through Maduro's vice president. And I kind of thought, like at the beginning, like that doesn't make any sense. How's that going to work? And I don't know. For the moment, it seems to be working. Like, okay, and I think he thinks that went so well that let's do it again. because everybody hates Iran. And again, I'm saying that with sort of scare quotes, but in the US political context, no one's for the Iranian government. So let's do this. And it'll be awesome. And he is sort of lashing out in these ways, as I've said in other contexts, through the parts of presidential power that are totally unconstrained. It's making him, it's a sort of psychological self care for him. As he gets less popular, as his power domestically wanes, he can be all powerful abroad. And that feels awesome. And I really think, there's, I think that's why this happened. There are lots of people all the time proposing really dangerous and stupid things to Donald Trump all the time. So he can jump on board a dangerous and stupid thing at a moment's notice, because there's whatever dangerous thing, whatever dangerous and stupid thing you're thinking about, there's a group in his inner circle that's all for it. He might have invaded Greenland, but he's doing Iran. So in addition to the instability that he has unleashed in the Middle East and economically worldwide, and on a longer term basis, geopolitically worldwide, he's also introduced, I think, an intense instability within the United States, because I think in pretty short order, you are going to see him kind of becoming the big critic of the war he started, right? Because you even see it now. Like you have that thing that aging autocrats seem like Trump seem to have often, where he'll be doing one of his Trump riffs, and he'll have moments in those riffs where he starts saying what he's actually thinking. I don't know if you saw this, Kate, but there was one interview where he said, "Yeah, there was we killed the main guys and his friends, and there were these other guys who we thought maybe they could form the new government, but I just heard they're dead too. So I don't know what's going to happen now." And on one hand, you kind of think, "Wow, you are so stupid," but on the other hand, you're like, "Thanks for the candor." Because now I'm realizing you thought this was like Venezuela, but you killed those people too.
Right. I mean, it's the same way a reporter asked, why was there no evacuation plan for Americans in the region? And he's like, well, it happened fast. It's like, you did it. But we have to wrap up. We're going long, but I have to say before we finish that the position of JD Vance right now is so funny that it like a little bit softens what is like overall just a horrific situation. Like, we already saw those like little schoolgirls all get killed. There's so much pain and suffering that's going to be unleashed by this, that the people who are responsible for that pain and suffering will never ever face account. And that really rankles me. But JD has been doing this delicate dance of trying to carve out a future path, that is as insulated as possible from a potentially negative reaction to this administration, which, we saw Kamala try to do it. It is really hard to do when you're the vice president. But the primary way that he has tried to kind of build out his own niche is in this isolationist, hyper nationalist, we're not sending your sons and daughters to go die in deserts anymore kind of attitude. Um, and now he is on record like saying out loud that we're not going to go to war with Iran like a few months ago. And now he is stuck in this. And the way that he is trying to extricate himself is just a joy to watch. It's like he wasn't in the big kind of makeshift war room. He's at the kids' table with Tulsi Gabbard, the other like staunch anti-interventionist person who's now just had to like shut up after that being her one kind of crusade for her entire time in political life. And the JD Vance camp is just spinning in all of these media outlets. Like, we're getting these leaks about like, well, JD didn't really want to do this. Like, he was opposed, but he thought if we did do it, then just one big strike and get out. It's just like all these hilarious details that are so transparently are coming from him to show like, well, I didn't like it, but this isn't my thing. And it's just Oh, it's a joy to watch because he can't do anything explicit without Trump getting pissed at him. He's completely caught in between a war and a hard place here.
There was something, I think it was like in, Axios or something like this, that, describing what you were describing, but I guess maybe newly this morning, the new argument was, uh, you know, forever wars, that was like wars in the Middle East when we were trying to like overthrow governments and tied to oil and this is totally different because President Trump has very clear objectives here, and
Oh,
you're
yeah.
and you're sort of like, I don't want to like essentialize about whole regions, but you say like, I don't know, it's literally next door to Iraq. It's also a bordering the Persian Gulf. It's right there. It's like right there, and it seems pretty similar. I mean, almost to the extent that I wrote a piece I think yesterday about how the elite conversation on this is so different from the sort of the popular conversation. Um, but and part of that is that because this elite conversation about whether the U.S. should use military force to overthrow the Iranian government, foreign policy people have been arguing about that for 30 years. Arguably, they've been arguing about it for more than 40 years. It is just like there's a lot of countries in the world, but like something like a third of of U.S. foreign policy and national security brain power, such as it is for the last 40 years, is about this question, right? And the runner-up, or maybe the only thing that's been discussed more, was whether to overthrow the Iraqi government. So like these things are so conjoined, and even though obviously the countries are very different in U.S. thinking, are so conjoined, and then you come to the point of clear objectives. He's within the first 36 hours, he had four or five different objectives of why we were doing this. I mean, he's this is clearly a case where he was convinced this was awesome, and this was his sort of legacy project. Everybody was going to be excited. Lots of presidents had wanted to do it, but only Trump had had the guts to do it. All this kind of stuff. That he decided it was awesome, and then once he decided it was awesome and did it, then he started coming up with what the explanations were. So yeah, JD is. I mean, look, it's one of these things where on the one hand we see him being hapless about this, which he is, but I mean, like, have some sympathy for the guy. He's making his brand anti-interventionism and isolationism, and Trump, based on we don't even know what, launched this massive war with no explanation. Not even no explanation in the sense of like a good argument that the public could get behind, even a bad argument that the public disagreed with. They just it kind of didn't really talk about it at all. And so what do you expect JD to do? I mean, I guess he could just say, I'm fucked. Maybe I'll go
I
back to
don't
being senator. I don't know.
I don't know what he's going to do because it's hard for me to see a world where he doesn't have a challenge from his rightward flank come 28, and that challenge is not premised in large part by an argument about kind of the elites, spending your money and your lives on things you don't want, and the another Middle East war is going to be on the top of that list.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
Trump Vance Iran war, he's in the administration. There's just not much you
yeah,
can do about it.
yeah. And there's being in administration and being vice president.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and and it's funny that again in one of these other newsletters this morning, uh, you're at least seeing discussion that there's this big MAGA sort of revolt over it, where a significant number of the sort of the in that world is really about influencers in a lot of ways more than elected officials,
Mhm.
but that there's really a kind of pretty widespread resistance of people not just doing what I think we talked about earlier in this episode, not just doing like, oh, Trump is awesome, but clearly he's getting some bad, some bad advice here or something like that. Of a lot of them saying like, "What the fuck?" I thought, aside from like making sure you don't go to jail for the things you did, I thought the big thing about our movement was no more foreign war, no more forever wars, and like, so what the actual fuck is this? So anyway, to be seen whether they can get everybody back in line. I mean, you do. I will say that you put this together with the Epstein files. You do see there is. It's always hard for liberals, opponents of Trump, to see anything that is genuinely populist about MAGA, and basically, I think that's right. It is um, in many ways overwhelmingly an elite-driven movement. Having said that, there is a dimension of it, at least with its foot soldiers, which has this very basic, not particularly articulated or consistent, but the elites who have more than us, who never are responsible for anything, and in those hands, it often very quickly descends into kind of a very kind of raw kind of anti-Semitism, or just kind of conspiracy theorizing. But you do kind of see in this war everything that has kind of come out about the Epstein stuff. You see, you know, there's a lot to work with there about who are the people who are calling the shots here, and
Mhm.
who are the people who are accountable for anything. So we will see. Let me remind you, as I said at the beginning of the episode, we just launched our annual membership sign up drive here at TPM. If you are a listener to the podcast, but you're not that familiar with the site, you can go over to talkingpointsmemo.com. We also have a 25% discount for the duration of this campaign. So if you're not a member, if you're interested, please go and sign up. Anything else we have to discuss in this episode?
Nope, that's all. See you
All
next
right.
week.
Talk to you next week.